10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 57. Conclusion of the story of a Naiad and of a Dryad.
"Phyllis," said Saint Aignan, with a glance of defiance at Montalais, such as a fencing master would give who invites an antagonist worthy of him to place himself on guard, "Phyllis is neither fair nor dark, neither tall nor short, neither too grave nor too gay. Though but a shepherdess, she is as witty as a princess, and as coquettish as the most finished flirt that ever lived. Nothing can equal her excellent vision. Her heart yearns for everything her gaze embraces. She is like a bird which, always warbling, at one moment skims the ground, at the next rises fluttering in pursuit of a butterfly, then rests itself upon the topmost branch of a tree, where it defies the bird catchers either to come and seize it, or to entrap it in their nets." The portrait bore such a strong resemblance to Montalais that all eyes were directed towards her. She, however, with her head raised, and with a steady, unmoved look, listened to Saint Aignan as if he were speaking of an utter stranger. "Is that all, Monsieur de Saint Aignan?" inquired the princess. "Oh, your royal highness, the portrait is but a mere sketch, and many more additions could be made, but I fear to weary your patience or offend the modesty of the shepherdess, and I shall therefore pass on to her companion, Amaryllis."
"Very well," said Madame. "Pass on to Amaryllis, Monsieur de Saint Aignan. We are all attention."
"Amaryllis is the eldest of the three, and yet," Saint Aignan hastened to add, "this advanced age does not reach 20 years."
Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, who had knitted her brows at the commencement of the description, unbent them with a smile.
"She is tall, with an astonishing abundance of beautiful hair, which she fastens in the manner of the Grecian statues. Her walk is full of majesty, her attitude haughty. She has the air, therefore, rather of a goddess than a mere mortal, and, among the goddesses, she most resembles Diana the huntress, with this sole difference, however, that the cruel shepherdess, having stolen the quiver of a young love while poor Cupid was sleeping in a thicket of roses, instead of directing her arrows against the inhabitants of the forest, discharges them pitilessly against all the poor shepherds who pass within reach of her bow and of her eyes."
"Oh, what a wicked shepherdess!" said Madame. "She may some day wound herself with one of those arrows she discharges, as you say, so mercilessly on all sides."
"It is the hope of the shepherds, one and all," said Saint Aignan.
"And that of the shepherd Amyntas in particular, I suppose?" said Madame.
"The shepherd Amyntas is so timid," said Saint Aignan, with the most modest air he could assume, "that if he cherishes such a hope as that, no one has ever known anything about it, for he conceals it in the very depths of his heart."
A flattering murmur of applause greeted this profession of faith on behalf of the shepherd. "And Galatea?" inquired Madame. "I am impatient to see a hand so skillful as yours continue the portrait where Virgil left it, and finish it before our eyes."
"Madame," said Saint Aignan, "I am indeed a poor dumb post beside the mighty Virgil. Still, encouraged by your desire, I will do my best."
Saint Aignan extended his foot and hand, and thus began:
"White as milk, she casts upon the breeze the perfume of her fair hair tinged with golden hues, as are the ears of corn. One is tempted to inquire if she is not the beautiful Europa, who inspired Jupiter with a tender passion as she played with her companions in the flower-spangled meadows. From her exquisite eyes, blue as azure heaven on the clearest summer day, emanates a tender light, which reverie nurtures and love dispenses. When she frowns or bends her looks towards the ground, the sun is veiled in token of mourning. When she smiles, on the contrary, nature resumes her jollity, and the birds, for a brief moment silenced, recommence their songs amid the leafy covert of the trees. Galatea," said Saint Aignan in conclusion, "is worthy of the admiration of the whole world, and if she should ever bestow her heart upon another, happy will that man be to whom she consecrates her first affections."
Madame, who had attentively listened to the portrait Saint Aignan had drawn, as indeed had all the others, contented herself with accentuating her approbation of the most poetic passage by occasional inclinations of her head; but it was impossible to say if these marks of assent were accorded to the ability of the narrator or to the resemblance of the portrait. The consequence, therefore, was, that as Madame did not openly exhibit any approbation, no one felt authorized to applaud, not even Monsieur, who secretly thought that Saint Aignan dwelt too much upon the portraits of the shepherdesses, and had somewhat slightingly passed over the portraits of the shepherds. The whole assembly seemed suddenly chilled. Saint Aignan, who had exhausted his rhetorical skill and his palette of artistic tints in sketching the portrait of Galatea, and who, after the favor with which his other descriptions had been received, already imagined he could hear the loudest applause allotted to this one, was himself more disappointed than the king and the rest of the company. A moment's silence followed, which was at last broken by Madame. "Well, sir," she inquired, "what is your majesty's opinion of these 3 portraits?" The king, who wished to relieve Saint Aignan's embarrassment without compromising himself, replied, "Why, Amaryllis, in my opinion, is beautiful." "For my part," said Monsieur, "I prefer Phyllis. She is a capital girl, or rather a good sort of fellow of a nymph." A general laugh followed, and this time the looks were so direct that Montalais felt herself blushing almost scarlet. "Well," resumed Madame, "what were those shepherdesses saying to each other?" Saint Aignan, however, whose vanity had been wounded, did not feel himself in a position to sustain an attack of new and refreshed troops, and merely said, "Madame, the shepherdesses were confiding to one another their little preferences." "Nay, nay, Monsieur de Saint Aignan, you are a perfect stream of pastoral poesy," said Madame with an irresistible smile, which somewhat comforted the narrator. "They confess that love is a mighty peril, but that the absence of love is the heart's sentence of death." "What was the conclusion they came to?" inquired Madame. "They came to the conclusion that love was necessary." "Very good. Did they lay down any conditions?" "That of choice simply," said Saint Aignan. "I ought even to add, remember that it is the Dryad who is speaking, that one of the shepherdesses, Amaryllis, I believe, was completely opposed to the necessity of loving, and yet she did not positively deny that she had allowed the image of a certain shepherd to take refuge in her heart." "Was it Amyntas or Tyrcis?" "Amyntas, Madame," said Saint Aignan modestly. "But Galatea, the gentle and soft-eyed Galatea, immediately replied that neither Amyntas, nor Alphesiboeus, nor Tityrus, nor indeed any of the handsomest shepherds of the country, were to be compared to Tyrcis; that Tyrcis was as superior to all other men as the oak to all other trees, as the lily in its majesty to all other flowers. She drew even such a portrait of Tyrcis that Tyrcis himself, who was listening, must have felt truly flattered at it, notwithstanding his rank as a shepherd. Thus, Tyrcis and Amyntas had been distinguished by Amaryllis and Galatea, and thus had the secrets of 2 hearts revealed beneath the shades of the evening and amid the recesses of the woods. Such, Madame, is what the Dryad related to me, she who knows all that takes place in the hollows of oaks and grassy dells, she who knows the loves of the birds and all they wish to convey by their songs, she who understands, in fact, the language of the wind among the branches, the humming of the insect with its gold and emerald wings, and the corolla of the wild flowers. It was she who related the particulars to me, and I have repeated them." "And now you have finished, Monsieur de Saint Aignan, have you not?" said Madame, with a smile that made the king tremble. "Quite finished," replied Saint Aignan, "and but too happy if I have been able to amuse your royal highness for a few moments." "Moments which have been too brief," replied the princess, "for they have related most admirably all you know. But, my dear Monsieur de Saint Aignan, you have been unfortunate enough to obtain your information from one Dryad only, I believe?" "Yes, Madame, only from one, I confess." "The fact was that you passed by a little Naiad who pretended to know nothing at all, and yet knew a great deal more than your Dryad, my dear comte." "A Naiad?"
repeated several voices, who began to suspect that the story had a continuation.
Of course, close beside the oak you are speaking of, which, if I am not mistaken, is called the Royal Oak, is it not so, Monsieur de Saint Aignan?
Saint Aignan and the king exchanged glances. "Yes, madame," the former replied.
Well, close beside the oak there is a pretty little spring, which runs murmuringly over the pebbles between banks of forget-me-nots and daffodils."
"I believe you are correct," said the king with some uneasiness, and listening with some anxiety to his sister-in-law's narrative.
"Oh, there is one, I can assure you," said Madame, "and the proof of it is, that the Naiad who resides in that little stream stopped me as I was about to come."
"Ah?" said Saint Aignan.
"Yes, indeed," continued the princess, "and she did so in order to communicate to me many particulars Monsieur de Saint Aignan has omitted in his recital."
"Pray relate them yourself, then," said Monsieur. "You can relate stories in such a charming manner." The princess bowed at the conjugal compliment paid to her.
"I do not possess the poetical powers of the comte, nor his ability to bring to light the smallest details."
"You will not be listened to with less interest on that account," said the king, who already perceived that something hostile was intended in his sister-in-law's story.
"I speak, too," continued Madame, "in the name of that poor little Naiad, who is indeed the most charming creature I ever met. Moreover, she laughed so heartily while she was telling me her story, that, in pursuance of that medical axiom that laughter is the finest physic in the world, I ask permission to laugh a little myself when I recollect her words."
The king and Saint Aignan, who noticed spreading over many of the faces present a distant and prophetic ripple of the laughter Madame announced, finished by looking at each other, as if asking themselves whether there was not some little conspiracy concealed beneath these words. But Madame was determined to turn the knife in the wound over and over again. She therefore resumed with the air of the most perfect candor, in other words, the most dangerous of all her airs.
"Well, then, I passed that way," she said, "and I found beneath my steps many fresh flowers newly blown. No doubt Phyllis, Amaryllis, Galatea, and all your shepherdesses had passed the same way before me."
The king bit his lips, for the recital was becoming more and more threatening.
"My little Naiad," continued Madame, "was cooing over her quaint little song in the bed of rivulets, as I perceived that she accosted me by touching the hem of my dress. I could not think of receiving her advances ungraciously, and more particularly so, since, after all, a divinity, even though she be of a second grade, is always of a greater importance than a mortal, though a princess. I thereupon accosted the Naiad, and bursting into laughter, this is what she said to me: 'Fancy, princess,' you understand, sire, it is the Naiad who is speaking?" The king bowed assentingly, and Madame continued: "Fancy, princess, the banks of my little stream have just witnessed a most amusing scene. Two shepherds, full of curiosity, even indiscreetly so, have allowed themselves to be mystified in a most amusing manner by three nymphs, or three shepherdesses. I beg your pardon, but I do not now remember if it was nymphs or shepherdesses she said, but it does not much matter, so we will continue."
The king, at this opening, colored visibly, and Saint Aignan, completely losing countenance, began to open his eyes in the greatest possible anxiety.
"The two shepherds," pursued my nymph, still laughing, "followed in the wake of the three young ladies. No, I mean of the three nymphs, forgive me, I ought to say, of the three shepherdesses. It is not always wise to do that, for it may be awkward for those who are followed. I appeal to all the ladies present, and not one of them, I am sure, will contradict me."
The king, who was much disturbed by what he suspected was about to follow, signified his assent by a gesture.
"But," continued the Naiad, "the shepherdesses had noticed Tyrcis and Amyntas gliding into the wood, and by the light of the moon they had recognized them through the groves of the trees. Ha! You laugh?" interrupted Madame. Wait, we are not yet at the end." The king turned pale. Saint Aignan wiped his forehead, now dewed with perspiration. Among the groups of ladies present could be heard smothered laughter and stealthy whispers. "The shepherdesses, I was saying, noticing how indiscreet the two shepherds were, proceeded to sit down at the foot of the royal oak, and when they perceived that their over-curious listeners were sufficiently near, so that not a syllable of what they might say could be lost, they addressed towards them very innocently, in the most artless manner in the world, indeed, a passionate declaration which, from the vanity natural to all men, and even the most sentimental of shepherds, seemed to the two listeners as sweet as honey." The king,
At these words, which the assembly was unable to hear without laughing, could not restrain a flash of anger darting from his eyes. As for Saint Aignan, he let his head fall upon his breast and concealed, under a silly laugh, the extreme annoyance he felt. "Oh," said the king, drawing himself up to his full height, "upon my word, this is a most amusing jest, certainly, but really and truly, are you sure you quite understood the language of the Naiads?" "The comte, sire, pretends to have perfectly understood that of the Dryads," retorted Madame icily. "No doubt," said the king, "but you know the comte has a weakness to aspire to become a member of the Academy, so that, with this object in view, he has learnt all sorts of things of which very happily you are ignorant, and it might possibly happen that the language of the nymph of the waters might be among the number of things you have not studied." "Of course, sire," replied Madame. "For the facts of that nature one does not altogether rely upon one's self alone. A woman's ear is not infallible, so says Saint Augustine, and I, therefore, wishing to satisfy myself by another opinion besides my own, and as my Naiad, who, in her character of a goddess, is polyglot, is that not the expression, Monsieur de Saint Aignan?"
"I believe so," said the latter, quite out of countenance.
"Well," continued the princess, "as my Naiad, who, in her character of a goddess, had at first spoken to me in English, I feared, as you suggest, that I might have misunderstood her, and I requested Mesdemoiselles de Montalais, de Tournay-Charente, and de la Valliere to come to me, begging my Naiad to repeat to me in the French language the recital she had already communicated to me in English."
"And did she do so?" inquired the king.
"Oh, she is the most polite divinity it is possible to imagine. Yes, sire, she did so that no doubt whatever remains on the subject. Is it not so, young ladies?" said the princess, turning toward the left of her army. "Did not the Naiad say precisely what I have related? And have I, in any one particular, exceeded the truth, Phyllis? I beg your pardon, I mean Mademoiselle Aure de Montalais."
"Precisely as you have stated, madame," articulated Mademoiselle de Montalais very distinctly.
"Is it true, Mademoiselle de Tournay-Charente?"
"The perfect truth," replied Athenais, in a voice quite as firm, but not yet so distinct.
"And you, La Valliere?"
asked Madame. The poor girl felt the king's ardent look fixed upon her. She dared not deny, she dared not tell a falsehood. She merely bowed her head, and everybody took it for a token of assent. Her head, however, was not raised again, chilled as she was by a coldness more bitter than that of death. This triple testimony overwhelmed the king. As for Saint Aignan, he did not even attempt to dissemble his despair, and, hardly knowing what he said, he stammered out,
"An excellent jest, admirably played."
"A just punishment for curiosity," said the king in a hoarse voice. "Oh, who would think, after the chastisement that Tyrcis and Amyntas had suffered, of endeavoring to surprise what is passing in the heart of shepherdesses? Assuredly I shall not, for one. And you, gentlemen?"
Nor I," repeated in chorus the group of courtiers.
Madame was filled with triumph at the king's annoyance, and was full of delight, thinking that her story had been, or was to be, the termination of the whole affair. As for Monsieur, who had laughed at the two stories without comprehending anything about them, he turned towards De Guiche and said to him,
"Well, comte, you say nothing. Can you not find something to say? Do you pity Monsieur Tyrcis and Monsieur Amyntas, for instance?"
"I pity them with all my soul," replied De Guiche, "for, in very truth, love is so sweet a fancy that to lose it, fancy though it may be, is to lose more than life itself. If, therefore, these two shepherds thought themselves beloved, if they were happy in that idea, and if, instead of that happiness, they meet not only that empty void which resembles death, but jeers and jests at love itself, which is worse than 1,000 deaths, in that case I say that Tyrcis and Amyntas are the two most unhappy men I know." "And you are right, too, Monsieur de Guiche," said the king, "for in fact the injury in question is a very hard return for a little harmless curiosity." "That is to say, then, that the story of my Naiad has displeased the king?" asked Madame, innocently. "Nay, Madame, undeceive yourself," said Louis, taking the princess by the hand. "Your Naiad, on the contrary, has pleased me, and the more so because she was so truthful, and because her tale, I ought to add, is confirmed by the testimony of unimpeachable witnesses." These words fell upon La Valliere, accompanied by a look that no one, from Socrates to Montaigne, could have exactly defined. The look and the king's remark succeeded in overpowering the unhappy girl, who, with her head upon Montalais's shoulder, seemed to have fainted away. The king rose without remarking this circumstance, of which no one, moreover, took any notice, and contrary to his usual custom, for generally he remained late in Madame's apartments, he took his leave, and retired to his own side of the palace. Saint Aignan followed him, leaving the rooms in as much despair as he had entered them with delight. Mademoiselle de Tonnay Charente, less sensitive than La Valliere, was not much frightened, and did not faint. However, it may be that the last look of Saint Aignan had hardly been so majestic as the king's. Chapter 57.